fascism is not something different from free market capitalism, right? Free market capitalism is a complete invention. What the market requires is, again, the protection of the social relation. So intervention of the state through austerity. Austerity is not less state, it's an intervention of the state. And Mussolini did exactly that.
My name is Bhaskar Sankara, and I'm the editorial director of the English edition of Jacobin. I'm here with Clara Mate, who is a professor of economics and the director of the Center for Heterodox Economics at the University of Tulsa. And we're here to talk about her new book, and we're here to talk about the idea of austerity and why it plagues so many of our lives here in the advanced capitalist world. So to begin with, Clara, I'm wondering if you could tell me why governments pursue austerity.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here with you. That is not an easy question to answer. I would say that the historical political economy approach that I adopt in my work allows us to see how it's never only about an evil president or minister and the subjective kind of inclinations of the individual, but how actually we have to look at how the governments and the state have a very important role to play in order to protect the social hierarchies that are the foundation of our economic system. So in a way, how the thesis that emerges out of the historical reconstructions, which is a strong one, is to say austerity is actually quite in the DNA of capitalism as our current socioeconomic system. And so it is actually the best form of economic management of our economy, not for people, but for the logic of profit that is grounding our economic order.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate. So just so viewers know that I haven't turned to the neoliberal right. But I guess the counter that you would often hear is that we in the West have a huge portion of our budgets are devoted to entitlement programs. Even the United States, those of us in the left often focus on the military budget and things like that. But around half of our budget are New Deal and Great Society programs. So Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid constitute around 48% of the US budget alone. So the counter argument would be austerity has been a way for us to prune this federal budget, so we focus on maintaining the programs that we care about the most, these important entitlement programs, without big waves of taxation that might hurt individual workers, but also might hurt companies that need to use their funds to productively invest. And as long as we're in a capitalist system, that investment needs to happen in the private sector, and all the receipts can't go to the government. So what would you say to this narrative about that comes maybe more from the center in U.S. politics and politics broadly in the advanced capitalist world, which isn't we should burn down everything, but we need targeted austerity to preserve what's important?
Right. And I think that is quite of a myopic view because it understands ultimately austerity as a matter of prudence, of fiscal responsibility. So it gives this false impression that our technocrats or the experts in government in a way care of the good of the whole of society at large. What you find out in the United States is that 52% of families can't afford to basically save for emergencies, and we have 78% of the workers who live paycheck to paycheck. So clearly we are in a situation in which the impoverishment and the disempowerment of people is producing a social crisis that we see in any possible way, from the addiction, the epidemic of opioids, the incarceration rates, the fact that just in New York City we have 1 out of 8 children in public schools homeless. This is more than 140,000 children just in New York City who are homeless. So these are conditions of social catastrophe in a way that you can see just by walking around anywhere you live in the United States. Right now I'm in Tulsa, and it's just the level of dehumanization of the population is pretty impressive. So austerity really is these are the effects of austerity, because what you see is that austerity is not about taxing less. The point is that austerity is about regressive taxation, right? So what is important is not to reduce austerity to just the state spending less. The state is spending a lot, but if we also go look at how much the state spends to basically subsidize, de-risk, and incentivize private investors, while reducing to its bare bones the help of people. And now we see that, of course, with the current Trump government, we will have an acceleration, a violent acceleration of austerity, with even the idea of getting rid of the Department of Education, to basically fund cuts in taxes to the rich. In the United States, structurally, capital is detaxed, and who is taxed is labor. So this is, I think, important to note, that this story that if we just tighten our belts, we will have more resources to channel for the growth of the economy that supposedly benefits everyone, is highly unrealistic, because it does not depict what is ultimately a class warfare that is enriching the few. The recent data shows that the billionaires currently accumulate 5.7 billion a day, while the impoverishment of the majority, even in the United States, keeps increasing. So this scissor is the effect of austerity, and the story that actually what we're doing here is being rational about our budget is false, especially if you consider the fact that indeed money is being spent to basically guarantee the profits of the big corporations in the military-industrial complex, in the carceral system, the privatization even of the problem of destitution, right? How destitute people are no longer employable, so you can't really extract surplus value from them. What you do is you make a profit out of them by privatizing all of these social security nets. So what we've seen is a complete disintegration of the social system. And also, you also have to consider that the economy, you also need to consider these numbers in proportion to how inflation grows, right? And most of these programs, even at the local level, never keep up with inflation. And so this is, I think, a part of the story that needs to be considered.
What would you say to the idea that, obviously with DOGE, things are changing in the U.S., and we're seeing a very vicious austerity program that doesn't even pretend to be in the broad social interests. They're just looking around for programs that disproportionately help marginalized groups, and they're looking for, in a very naked way, programs that have a social purpose. But what would you say to the argument that in the last 20 years, let's say before this January and the 20 years prior in the United States, that there was continued liberalization, but there wasn't actually a lot of austerity? If you compare to the U.S. response to, let's say, the 2008 financial crisis, or the U.S. response to the pandemic, you saw a lot of government debt grow because you saw a lot of government stimulus, whereas Europe kept to the relatively orthodox fiscal approaches. I don't know what the debt limit percentage is, but I guess like 60% roughly of GDP, or whatever the EU mandated debt limit is. What would you say to the idea that we've been living in an era of liberalization, but not necessarily austerity, at least in certain parts of the advanced capitalist world?
Again, I think these are all discourses that historical work can try to dismantle, in the fact that they're hurting those who suffer from this economic system, because they don't really point the finger to what is happening. It is very important to note that how Trump is clearly revealing a tendency that was there well before him, but he is revealing it in a very explicit way, because there's not even the excuse of a financial issue right now, right? The interesting thing is that there's just austerity is revealing its real face, which is the fact that you need to reassert and continue asserting the subordination of the working classes, which again is not something that happens once and for all. And I think a lot of the left has an issue really politicizing the economy, because they take for granted that we do live under a world that in which wage labor is a truth and something that is impossible to overcome. But ultimately, what the analysis here is that austerity actually serves the purpose of protecting this very social relation that is so oppressive and yet so crucial for economic growth in the first place. So I would say that, you know, if you look closely, even the Biden administration didn't really veer out of the logic of austerity. Of course, there's moments, again, in which it is much more accelerated and obvious, as the one we're currently living in. But, you know, if you just look at where the resources were going, and I think the amount that was serving the interest of the concentration of power of the large asset managers in the green economy and the war economy and so forth is really important to consider, because under Biden, and this is something that rarely people say, actually child poverty rates doubled in just 2 years. And so now we have 1 out of 7 children in absolute poverty in the United States. And this was because the Congress did not really continue this basic support programs for poor families in the United States. And this was a political decision. The money went elsewhere. So I think it is important for us to realize that there's not a lot of political will to social redistribute. And this is because social redistribution is not just a technical issue. Again, it's not just about the current president being a bad guy. It's about the fact that social redistribution historically, even in the United States, is politically problematic. If you redistribute resources to the population, you risk empowering people in thinking that they can have a different role in society that is not just that of accepting poverty wages and accepting what their boss tells them to do. And this is really, really crucial, I think, is that even if you look back at the post-Second World War, you realize that a lot of economists realized that there were limits to what supposedly could be the Keynesian dream of social redistribution, even if ultimately Keynes was not too much about social redistribution, but that's another story, because of the fundamental problem of empowering the population. Lyndon Johnson, his programs, especially at the local level, were seen as very bad politically because they were empowering the vulnerable in a way that people were actually then at that point demanding real participation in economic decisions, which is something that is structurally incompatible with our economic system. So it was enough already to see the effect that the small amount of money going to people with the pandemic had on the labor market. It had a horrible effect for the elite. Why? Because ultimately it mobilized people either to just quit and try to live in a different way. And again, it's real numbers. 30% of the labor force in 2022 left on their own. Of course, others found different jobs, but the point is that the bargaining power at that point was on the side of the workers. Unions started organizing. Strikes were being won. This is a situation that, of course, it's little with respect to the story I tell is about the post-First World War and the actual existential crisis of capitalism then. But the idea is that these existential crises are never overcome once and for all, because as Marx tells us, capital is a social relation. And by definition, it is historical and political. So I think here the story is that there is a true sense by which I do believe that especially the left has to come to terms with the fact that not everything is possible under a capitalist economy. You can't have, growth led by private investors and a content majority that has actually all their needs met and an equitable distribution. This is actually incompatible because the pillars of capitalism, wage labor, and private command over investment, are political. And once you shift the resources, once again workers have a good moment in which, for example, unemployment is low, these are moments in which there's a challenge to the political power of the elite. And I think this is a story that needs to be considered, because there's no way of just like overcoming neoliberalism by going back to like a supposed golden moment, because the golden moment was politically fraught. And ultimately, if you see the limits even of, again, of the war against poverty of Lyndon Johnson were enormous. It lasted very little. It could do much less than it was thought, but not because there wasn't resources, because it was politically problematic. And I think this issue about how we need to politicize our economy always is something that economists avoid, that the left often avoids by just thinking that ultimately we are in a steady state, in a static state. But I think this loses a lot of the conceptual power of scholarship that actually can help think more imaginatively and also really critically about the present.
Well, I think this gets to something that a lot of Marxists knew even before the emergence of mass welfare states and social democracy, kind of the political aspect of full employment, which I guess also applies to the amount of social spending. Because if
Yes.
you're giving people a way to leave wage labor and drop out of the economy, either because they could rely on state and social services, or because they have such bargaining power they could continue to make economic, democratic demands in their workplace, then you are going too far for the limits of capitalism. And I feel like this is one of the big contradictions of even the left wing of social democracy, is that it was pushing too far, too much socialism, but also not enough socialism to go beyond
Exactly.
capitalism.
Exactly.
But I'm wondering, what are we in the 21st century when we are at a point where we saw the failure of every model of capitalism, from neoliberal capitalism to social democracy, little doses of socialism within capitalism, but also the failures of state socialism and of command economies. What do we look for when we're thinking about imagining a world beyond capitalism and beyond austerity?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily a question for me to answer, but I do think that, again, history can teach that indeed breaching market dependence, which is really the trap in which the majority is in, and it's actually what austerity increases, right? So the whole idea in this book is actually that austerity policies are not irrational. They might not work to balance the budget. They rarely work to balance the budget. And again, austerity is very expensive, and austerity is very much compatible, by the way, with the rearmament. Biden spent $916 billion in 2024 on the war, largely financing the death and the desperation of an entire population in Palestine. This was not contrary to the logic of austerity, because again, austerity is about shifting resources in favor of the saving, investing classes, in favor of those who make an income through capital gains and interest, right? So this whole point that austerity has never actually, and then austerity, of course, is about regressive taxation. It's about monetary deflation, and monetary deflation, by definition, produces downturns because it actually disincentivizes investment. But again, these downturns don't help balancing the budget, but what they do help is balancing the rate of exploitation back to a point that is congenial to capital accumulation. So the thesis here is that austerity does not work for what it's like sold for. It does work for something much more fundamental that our economy requires, because it increases our market dependence, which is exactly what you were pointing out in saying that ultimately wage labor is all there is in town. Again, this needs to be enforced, and it's enforced through these measures that increase unemployment, so increase the competition with workers, privatize, deregulate, and ultimately cut social spending and increase the taxes on the workers. Well, all of this has to be understood in order, I think, to think really profoundly about what the alternatives would look like. And I do think that ultimately history shows that breaching market dependence is not impossible. The story I tell in the book is what happened after the First World War, a moment that was extremely interesting and for a clear reason forgotten by bourgeois historians and economists. It's actually a chapter of history that is very understudied. But if you do study it, you find out that the experiments that were on the table before, of course, the appropriation of power, also in the Soviet Union from the elite, was really about economic democracy, which is a word that actually the left rarely uses. And I think this is very wrong because it is a very powerful concept that is based on powerful historical experiments that are everywhere in the world still now, by the way, but in 1919, 1920 were really operating to subvert that very market dependence and the wage relation and private command over investment. How? In different ways. I compare Italy to Britain to show how, there are different models and patterns to gain economic democracy. In Italy, there were the councils, the factory councils that were very strong. They had gotten a lot of credibility from the workers because of their capacity to oppose the oppression of the state during the war that was actually increasing the rate of exploitation for workers in order to produce more effectively. And these councils, though, worked in a way that was truly original in their capacity to say, well, workers can really create knowledge and create institutional alternatives by practicing assemblies and figuring out things one step at a time. That's why for me it is very problematic when academics speculate about a potential future. I think the point is that this potential future has to be lived and experimented with through praxis. Ultimately, Gramsci did not come up with the concept of praxis in prison alone. He was in prison when he wrote about praxis, but the reality is that he lived praxis. He came up with the concept because he was participating with the workers in the occupation of the factories in 1919, in which the workers showed very clearly how they did not need a Giovanni Agnelli or other bosses in order to actually produce. And that production could also be not just based on profit, it could also be based on social need. And by the way, right now in Italy, there's a huge struggle going on with a factory of ex-GKN that I had the pleasure of connecting with. They're showing the exact same thing. The point is there, of course, is that the state is not willing to, give access to the means of production to workers because this sets a really, really, really dangerous example of how this factory can switch from producing car parts that are completely ecologically unsustainable to creating cargo bikes that are actually embedded within the very needs of the community around them, right? And actually the idea that actually factories or production sites can be sites that are sites of social relations with the rest of the city. So these examples are very empowering, but also very dangerous because they set precedents. And these precedents have existed. They've also been repressed. In Britain, there were the Guild Socialists who were very, very actually successful in 1920. They did get indeed support from local governments and to compete, and they were showing how they were doing better than their market, their private investors in the same field. So these experiments exist. Of course, they're not in themselves going to be the end game, because we know that ultimately all these forms of self-governance ultimately do end up being still part of the real competition game. So we need also to think more broadly politically, but I do think that these are really important experiments that do exist, and so we should really start from there and participate and bring them around the world more than just speculate.
Well, Marx often remarked, because he was in an environment where socialism had been dominated for so long by the utopians, That's where his kind of injunction against writing recipes for the cook shop, so the future, came from. But I think you do get to something important, which is these experiments and these models, I think, um, show and remind people that an alternative to capitalism is possible, even if we don't know the exact contours of the alternative. So I'm wondering whether we could talk a little bit though about the rise of the far right. Um, and you could see in America Trumpism being an example, at the very least, a far right populist movement that definitely has some fascist elements. In Europe and certain countries, you've seen the rise of an explicitly fascist right. So I'm wondering if you could describe this rise in the context of austerity, and also what program these parties are actually offering. Are they offering, even on paper, some sort of alternative to fascism? Are they offering on paper even an alternative to austerity, I should say? Are they offering very little at all in practice in the 21st century? And also, if you could relate it back to that interwar period and the appeal of fascist forces to workers who were obviously in conditions of extreme deprivation and exploitation.
Yeah. So I think we can, and again, I also want to specify that historical reality is extremely complex, but I do think that the role of the scholar is to potentially set some guiding threads on how we can interpret, but these threads are not the only ones around, right? So there clearly are other issues to consider. But the story I tell in this book that I think has incredible resonance historically in many different moments, including today, is that austerity, again, is very powerful and successful in disempowering the workers, right? So it creates the material conditions of increased market dependence that then go hand in hand with the ideological construction of consent that I describe being also very much related to economic models. So actually, in my work, I've studied very much the political implications of the assumptions that underlie the neoclassical framework, which is actually the framework everyone is exposed to if people study economics. So the way in which these models convince workers that they have no say in the game because they are not the center of value production. Actually, value is the realization of the marginal productivity of capital, and actually how profit is not at all the theft of through the unpaid labor of the worker, but it's actually the correct compensation for the contribution of capital that comes somehow from this like virtuous capacity to save of the savior investor, right? So this whole narrative that is very important because it has not lived forever. Again, it is the fundamental, I think, shift away from the Ricardian Marxian framework that was empowering workers in the late 1800s, as well as the interwar period, in which the theory was labor is at the center of value production. And so workers are indeed fundamental to run even a capitalist economy, so they could run an economy that is not capitalist as well. The story is actually it is the savior investors who we should thank for their capacity to employ the workers in the first place. So a really important shift that I describe in the book being very much part and parcel of the assertion of pure economics as this objective science that is capable of explaining the world through a lens that is a lens that does good for the justification of social hierarchies, of course. Well, this combination of austerity as a policy and austerity as a theoretical interpretation of the world has had an effect at all levels in this society, from, again, the way people are ashamed of being poor and ultimately see themselves as being responsible of their social condition. And thus, ultimately, what you see is the support for the far right. And this is like a very banal thing to say. But again, it's to say austerity is not neutral politically. It's not about balancing the budget. It's actually a way to change the relations of production and to perpetuate the capital order. And in this sense, the success of the far right today is the expression of this. It's the fact that people have given up a systemic view about how capitalism, not given up, they are not, it's very difficult to get to it if you're not lucky and have a chance to study it, because the messages you get from society, plus the worry about getting to the end of the month as the only possible worry, because that is actually, you have to feed your children and you can't, well, that produces the fact that the far right gets support. And so you hate the immigrant, you hate the one below you, not the one above you. So this is clearly what we see today. But I think part of the story that I think is important to consider is that fascism is the best way to implement austerity, which is, again, I think going back to, does fascism, or anyway, these authoritarian alternatives, are they actually an alternative? And I would say no, because it's a self-fulfilling process. Not only austerity produces greater support for authoritarian governments, these authoritarian governments are then the ones best placed to do more austerity. And this we see with Benito Mussolini, that is kind of the focus of my own work, to get to the last part of your question, is that in fact Mussolini, and this is a conversation I think is important to have, is that fascism is not something different from free market capitalism, right? Free market capitalism is a complete invention. What the market requires is, again, the protection of the social relation. So intervention of the state through austerity. Austerity is not less state, it's an intervention of the state. And Mussolini did exactly that. Mussolini came into power. It was not a coup. He was called by the king and by the government to actually resolve the crisis of capitalism in that moment. And when he came in, he convinced the liberals very well, both within Italy and abroad, that he was able to implement austerity very successfully, which he did. So he implemented the Trinity that I discuss here. So he slashed social expenditures, he privatized, he was able to abolish strikes, abolish unions, cut wages by decree. And it worked in the sense that indeed Italy, as a dependent country, convinced foreign investors that it was a great place to invest. And if you read the Times at the time, the Brits are so happy. They're like, finally, we can go back and actually make some money in Italy. And so this is what you saw, by the way, also with Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany is a slightly different story in the sense that Hitler came into power in a moment in which indeed austerity had run its course of disempowering the German people, right? Austerity had been basically implemented for at least the half of the 1920s. From 1924 all the way through 33, austerity was the guiding principle to try to rescue the German economy, given that it was also very dependent. And then when Hitler got into power, he fundamentally focused on militarization. But again, in this perspective, militarization is not the opposite of austerity. It completely fits the logic. It's a different phase of the austerity project with, of course, heavy repression of the working class, right? Actually, a key element of Nazi Germany's economic policy was the control over the wage labor, and also there eliminating the possibility to strike, eliminating free unions, and so forth. So again, we see two slightly different expressions of a very similar pattern. In Italy, it was clearly austerity worked clearly to crush the workers immediately through an authoritarian government that was necessary. It's more of like the Pinochet story. The Pinochet was loved because it was only through him that the revolutionary practices of Salvador Allende could be stopped. In the case of Germany, you see that austerity came up as the result of previous austerity, but this time in the hands of Hitler.
So that's a perfect place to end it. But since I'm a bad interviewer, I'm going to ask you one more question. It's probably going to lead us to a worse place to end it. But I find what's so refreshing in your work is that you're breaking with and challenging what seems to become a consensus on the liberal left, which is a return to a certain Keynesian analysis that offers obviously a version of anti austerity in its left wing iterations, but it is a version of anti austerity that still weds us to some form of capitalism, which ultimately, as we've been discussing, politically is incompatible with a socialist option, or even an option that leads to greater decommodification or worker emancipation. So I'm wondering if you could go back to a point you touched on earlier, and the kind of lay out a criticism of Keynesianism, and maybe why it might be worthwhile for people to revisit Marx, because I think even a lot of people who are politically in favor of the politically in favor of Marxism, at best seem to land in their analysis of the economy in the Keynesian tradition, if that makes sense.
Yes, and that makes a lot of sense. And actually, this book also has, as a side story, a critique of Keynesianism. Keynes has a small role to play in this book, but I do show, of course, that even before writing the general theory, he was more austere than his colleagues at the British Treasury, asking for 10% increase in interest rates in 1920 because of the fact that it was the only way, indeed, to tame the demands for economic democracy of the working class. And he's quite explicit that inflation is producing this social turmoil that ultimately is ending the command over private investment that for him is the only way we can envision a healthy society to exist. So, of course, the evolution of the Keynes in his general theory is a struggle of escape, as he puts it. But the struggle of escape is also a very limited capacity to escape, because he, of course, never goes back to problematizing the social relation of exploitation that is at the basis of a capitalist economy. He kind of eliminates that discourse, which is the political discourse that many economists, even in the left Keynesian circles, just have forgotten about. And this is an issue because, again, I think the issue of seeing the economy as just an object that you can manipulate and that you can find technical solutions to problems is completely unrealistic, because then what's interesting is that you see with My Economist, and the book I'm writing currently, or I'm trying to write currently, also shows how Keynesian economists themselves after the Second World War had to confront the limits of their apolitical theory when they tried to implement policymaking. It was clear that it looked very nice on paper, but then in reality, the social conflict, the class conflict was constantly emerging. So this is the problem, that these models are unrealistic, and what's worse is that they're disempowering, because they give a sense by which you can really solve all the issues if you leave it to the expert. And ultimately, we are in the best of possible world. You just need to tweak it a little and have the right people who are knowledgeable enough to lead economic policies, and not leave it to like the bad guys, Trump or whoever. This is a very, very narrow look at the world, because it universalizes our current socio-economic structure. And I think it's doing more harm than explicitly showing the violent face of austerity, which is what a lot of neoclassical economists do, is when they tell you, listen, you know what, if you want smooth economic growth, you got to do supply side economics, which means you got to deregulate labor, you got to privatize, you got to weaken the workers, you have to have a larger supply of labor in order to basically get the fundamentals of profit right. And they're correct in this, because they're seeing the truth in the game, which is that if you don't incentivize investors to invest, this economy does not run as it's supposed to. And again, this economy does not work for people, it works for profit. And this is, I think, a very strong point that is missed in the Keynesian analysis. The logic of need and the logic of profit are not usually compatible. They can be compatible in very rare moments in which the logic of need is instrumentalized for the logic of profit. But the two are often conflicting, as we're seeing right now, not only with the genocide in Gaza, with the climate catastrophe, with all of these instances in which the economy is actually getting stronger at the expense of human lives and ecologies, right? So to end, I would just like to say that I do think we need a much better version than just like obsolete Keynesianism to move forward. This and the historical analysis can help debunk a lot of these myths. And I also think that the myths are debunked by avoiding the usual position of many of my colleagues, which is I'm just going to sit back in my armchair, removed from the social struggles, and just theorize about the world. What we're trying to do with the CE, the new center I'm directing that just opened 3 months ago, is really an experiment of saying you can only come up with knowledge that is innovative and transformative if you connected with the social struggles, with the actual problems people face. People understand the economy much better than economists. And this is an issue. Even business people, because business people feel, for example, the pressure of real competition as a real thing. And how do you get out of that? You can't get out of that with like an easy technical solution. So it is through the connection with the actual issues that we can get novel theory. And this is what we're trying to do at the CE, is organize events that are, by the way, also something you can follow on our YouTube channel, to actually try to inspire young scholars, especially, to avoid this technocratic outlook that is so deeply conservative and classist. And hopefully, it's a small experiment, but if we all do our own part, maybe we will see a better future soon.
Well, C.L.R. James famously said that every cook can govern. I think our challenge is to apply that principle to the economy and have that faith in the capacity of ordinary people to shape their own futures. But thank you for the conversation. I hope all the viewers check out your book and the work you're doing at your institute.
Thank you so much, Bhaskar.